So welcome to week nine of Step Up into Life After High School. Go ahead and share my screen here. Where I live. So that'll be the start of the conversation tonight. We'll talk a little bit about housing vouchers, affordability in housing, what a PASA is again, and how we get connected to one. And then the SLS waiver and the housing options that are kind of within that SLS waiver. So again, if you have questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself during the presentation or throw it in the chat box and we'll come back and answer them tonight. So housing barriers. So housing, as you all know, living in the Denver metro area is not very affordable. And availability can be pretty lacking, and accessibility is kind of something we see often when we're trying to get someone with a disability, if it's a physical disability, into our home at times. So affordability, a person whose sole source of income is Social Security insurance, or SSI, like we've talked about, would need to pay around 120% of their income to rent for a one-bedroom apartment nationally. That is obviously a lot higher here in the Denver area because of how high pricing the markets are. A lot of individuals will have barriers such as security deposits, having a rental history, moving expenses, all play into that. So as your young adult is living with you, if they're over the age of 18 and you decide that they're going to pay rent, it's actually a really good idea to have them sign a basic lease. That gives them that moving, that like rental history a little bit, so that, you know, technically you're a landlord, they had a lease and they paid. Is it a very loose lease? Yes, but at least gives them something. Availability, so for every 100 extremely low income renter households, there are only 30 affordable rental units. So here in Colorado, unfortunately, there used to be a law that, you know, forever building wise, that they had to incorporate some low income housing into every, you know, multi-use kind of residential setting. They removed that they had to. Now it's an option they can take if they would like. Luckily, Colorado still has some pretty good laws and around that builders get some tax breaks for building low income housing into their unit systems that they're building for new apartments or condos, things like that. Because federal aid program or federal programs such as Section 8, or what we would call HUD, are officially typically full or waitlisted, and those are essentially how we'll talk a little bit tonight, how we get some of that rent to be a little more comparable for people with disabilities. Accessibility, so nationally 44% of all household housing discrimination complaints are typically aligned to disability inequality. So people with disabilities, when able to find affordable housing or, you know, the subsidies to help, might also face some discrimination, or you know, the apartment is on the second floor and they use you know, have a mobility device, wheelchair, a walker, or something like that, and there's no elevator, or there is one, but it's at the other end of the building, so it's, you know, having to trek down there, go up it to come all the way back, might face some discrimination or some inequality there that someone that might be, you know, able-bodied wouldn't have to face. So that's kind of all the stuff we typically know about housing barriers. So don't be discouraged by that. There are options for support and ways to make the system work for your loved one. So one is the ARCs encourage you to support laws and things into your area that bring low-income housing to your area. There's some myths about low-income housing, that low-income housing is the component of, like, brings down property values or brings crime, or I don't want that in my backyard idea. Repeated research, this is from 2019, shows that affordable housing not only has doesn't have a negative impact on housing and prices, or the speed of sales in the neighborhood. Actually, it does some of the opposite. 85% of affordable housing meets or exceeds federal quality standards, and over 40% of those houses are considered excellent quality. Really means you wouldn't know low-income housing in the state of Colorado unless you actually were the ones that were renting there. More often than not, research shows that there is no crime impact based on having low-income housing in the area compared to not. My parents live about a mile from me in a very nice kind of 55 plus community, and right down the street is some low-income affordable housing. Those condos are very nice, very well maintained. I only know they are because I've had to, try and help someone move into one, and with a disability. So they qualified for it because they're low-income housing. So there are, Arapahoe County has a pretty decent support of low-income or Section 8 housing. Douglas County does struggle a little bit with that. So supporting those bills, supporting laws that will change your county's thoughts around low-income housing is only going to benefit not only your loved one, but others with disabilities or that fall into that low-income system. There was an Excel spreadsheet that was sent tonight with a presentation that talks about all the different housing options for Section 8 or house choice vouchers here in the state of Colorado and federally. A Section 8 voucher, a HUD voucher, we'll kind of use those terms interchangeably. There are some differences in them, but for the most part, those are like Willy Wonka's golden ticket. There's only two things that move with your loved one if they ever leave the state of Colorado. One is Social Security. It goes everywhere. You just have to go back to whatever the Social Security office is in the new place you're living, whatever state, and tell them, and Social Security will start routing everything there. And also a federal Section 8 voucher. My boss, her son, uses Section 8 voucher to help with subsidize his rent. When and if they ever retire and the plan is for them to move to California, he'll take his Section 8 voucher with him to California because they can transfer across state lines. So we'll go into all the details of how you get a Section 8 voucher, but if we can get you one or your loved one one, they're really important to maintain because they're really going to help your loved one over the lifetime, even after you're gone. So housing vouchers are Section 8 are for low or income-based programs that help low-income families, elderly, or people with disabilities afford rent in the private market. About 1 in 3 households using a Section 8 voucher are headed by a non-elderly person with a disability. So it's not just for older people. It's not just for low income. It's kind of a mix in between. And again, that low income housing, essentially we'll explain how it works, the ratios here in a moment. You need to have a disability or be elderly to qualify. So your award letter from Social Security for your loved one, their Medicaid, award letter saying they have a disability so they qualify for Medicaid. Those are very good, standards to show that you meet qualifications for Section 8. They also have to be low income. Well, we have to keep them low income to qualify for the Medicaid waiver programs and not have more than $2,000 of assets, right? Like we talked about in the previous weeks. So probably 99% of you out there, your loved one would qualify for a Section 8 voucher. Tenants, typically pay about 30% of their income towards rent. So if we just did easy math, if they made $100, they pay about 30. And then the voucher, so the federal government or the state, depending on which voucher you're on, picks up the difference to a point. Finding a home in Section 8. So it's not like we build huge concrete buildings and say all of these are Section 8 housing. There are some buildings that are built specifically for low income, but there are low income buildings, rental units, probably in almost every apartment complex across the state and across the city of Denver here. There's not really a list of places. It's more based on if the landlord will accept it. So some apartment complexes or condos or townhomes, or even you can use it in a normal home. If the landlord will accept a Section 8 voucher, then you can live there. Most of those kind of bigger units have a certain amount that they'll kind of allow to be within. So if they have 100 apartments, maybe 10 of them can be Section 8. So they might, and it's not necessarily that this one apartment is the Section 8 apartment, it's that they only are going to allow 10 within the whole unit system. So, you know, I've been in people's apartments that are Section 8, and they're gorgeous apartments. There's one that's called Copperleaf. It's out kind of down in like the southern part of Littleton. It was like 2 blocks from where his parents lived, and they picked this apartment and they went and talked to the landlord, and the landlord accepted their Section 8 voucher. Because landlords and even the big companies get some tax benefits for accepting a Section 8, and it's guaranteed rent. So unlike you or me living in an apartment, if I lose my job, I might not be able to pay rent, and then eventually I'm evicted. Your loved one, if they have a Section 8 voucher, they always get paid. There's no doubt that they're not going to get at least 70% of the rental income. The struggle is there's limited funding and high need, so there's typically long wait lists for Section 8 vouchers. Also, because of how high Denver's rent currently sits, sometimes landlords don't want a Section 8 to take over a spot that they can be getting $1,400, $1,800, $2,300 for a 1-bedroom apartment. And yes, some apartments in Denver go for $1,800 to $2,300 for a 1-bedroom. Where a Section 8 voucher, they're not going to get that much because the federal government sets the high-end limit of what they'll pay. So that's where the Denver market kind of screws up with, you know, our system sometimes. The wait lists for Section 8 vouchers also open randomly. They have to be publicized by law. It used to be in the newspapers. Now it's typically either on their website, Facebook, and then through like different media outlets. So the news will, on the nightly news. We pay attention to the places that are Section 8 voucher locations, and we watch for them. So if you follow us on Facebook or our weekly update, as soon as we find one, we send it to you. We send it out and make sure everyone knows that there's a list opening up, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. You all should have gotten actually an email from me saying, here's a Section 8 voucher opening. So I keep a running list of anyone that's ever taken Step Up. And when a Section 8 voucher opens up, I email that to the whole list of anyone that's ever taken Step Up, because it is a big deal. If you need to get on the wait list, then it takes a little while, a few years sometimes, to get to the top of the wait list and actually get a voucher. So anytime we hear of an opening, we send it out to you. The nice thing with, you know, a voucher is you can make requests for accommodations, such as needing a first floor apartment, or like Carol's son, they have him in a second floor condo, because it's a lot less likely he's just going to wander out the door because he's not just on the first floor. So there can be accommodations made just like any other apartment that your loved one would move into related to their disability. There's a link here to the housing website so you can learn more about the various housing programs and what voucher programs really look like. Let me back up for a moment here. So the list, like I said, they open randomly, and not every place has a list. So like the city of Aurora has like 2 different entities that run different housing lists. The city of Littleton has their own list they run. Development Pathways actually runs a housing voucher list. But it's, again, open to anybody that can qualify. So if you're elderly, disabled, or in low income, you can qualify for a Section 8 voucher. So it's not just for the one DP runs for people with disabilities, but an entity that used to hold that list, used to be in charge of it, decided they didn't want to do that anymore. So they passed it off to Development Pathways. So their lists open up, like I said, randomly. There's no rhyme or reason to when they do. It's essentially by the entity that controls the waiting list. That list decides that it's manageable enough to add more people to, and that's when they open them up. It's not yearly. There's no mandate of how often they have to be opened up. I can tell you the one in Littleton opened up like 2 years ago, and I haven't seen it open up again. So it just depends on how quickly they kind of get fruition in the Section 8 system. If they get some more money put in from the feds and the state, they can essentially, offer more vouchers, which brings the list down again. So when and if you ever get an email from us or Development Pathways or another entity you work with, or you hear in the news that a Section 8 voucher list is opening up, you want to get, your loved one's application in. They typically open for like a day, so it'd be like October 20th from 8 to noon. The list is open. If you're working with Development Pathways, you can tell your case manager anytime they hear of a Section 8 list opening up to please send it to you. A lot of times, if it's the DP list, the one they've run, when it has opened up, your case manager actually can kind of do the paperwork for you and submit it, as long as they know that's what you want to be on that list. So that they're kind of doing it within the timeline of when DP sets its parameters for how long that list can be open. The list I recently sent you all was only open for 2 days. And again, you can be on as many lists as possible. You can be on all of them if you can ever get them all to be open and be on them. And once you accept one, you're kicked off all the other lists. So it doesn't matter if you're on the one in Littleton, if you're on the one in Arapahoe County, if you're on the Denver Section 8 housing list, as long as you're on a list, and you can be on all of them. So anytime you hear one, apply for them again, because you're kind of just playing the odds so you can get your Section 8 voucher. For our individuals, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's very little likelihood that they'll ever lose their Section 8 voucher, mostly because there are supports in place. There are people that are maintaining their paperwork. That's typically why people get kicked out of Section 8. They didn't resubmit their annual paperwork to keep their voucher. They broke the rule by having more than, having people that aren't on the lease living in their apartment. People with disabilities, our loved ones, don't do that because typically there's people around them to support them, to make sure that someone doesn't mooch off them and live there for free. They typically don't have a felony or major criminal activity that's going to, put them into, nope, they're not qualified for a Section 8 voucher. So, and again, there's a lot of supports around them to keep them safe, so they're not doing that kind of stuff to lose out on their Section 8 voucher. The idea is once you get a Section 8 voucher, you can have it forever, and your loved one can use it however you want. So getting on a list is the big deal. Getting that list, and it doesn't mean I was there at 8 a.m., I'm the first one on the waiting list. Nope, they randomize it. So how I explain it is they kind of take all the applications, put them in a pile, and throw that pile in the air and pick them all back up, and that's the list. So they do randomize it. So it's not like you can't line up and be like ensured you're the first one on the list. It just means you're somewhere randomly on that list. They typically don't tell you where you are on the list either, because it is such a moving thing again. And then they just call you and say you're eligible, or they'll send you a letter, and then you have to follow all the steps to finish it out. So one of the questions in the chat was, what's the difference between the two? Kind of vouchers, the state versus a federal. The federal one goes anywhere you want. More than likely, you're probably going to apply and be on a federal housing voucher, because those are the more robust, bigger lists. If you've got onto one that's a state-run list, those are ones where it says you have to live within the city and county of Denver for 12 consecutive months before you can move anywhere outside of Denver. Or you have to, live within these 3 counties, because it's a list, it's the, tri-county health list or whatever. So any list that has a name that has some limitations of, you have to live within this boundary for 6 months, a year, whatever it might be, those are typically state-run lists, which is fine if your loved one's never going to leave the state of Colorado, because that's where you live and that's where the rest of their family and loved ones and people who care for them live. Then being on a state list, state waiver voucher is great. If you plan like Carol does with Alex to move at some point to maybe California, the federal voucher is going to work better, because then he can take that with him. but more than likely you're going to be on a federal list, because those are there are more of them, and there are more spots on those lists than there are in the state backed lists. So any other questions about Section 8? Again, none of you are going to get it tomorrow. No matter if you're 18, 21, 25, you're just not going to get it tomorrow. You have to wait for a list to open. Once it is open, you get on that waiting list, and then some of them they only open it when they know they can process the waiting list within 6 months. Some of them open it when they feel it's manageable. Again, I have a friend that runs one of the lists, and she says often that it's pretty much when they get to a range that they feel like, okay, if we add more people, we don't have to hire another person to run this list. So it's only one person kind of running their Section 8 lists. And there are different requirements, different things the department has to be met by. There's a question, has COVID slowed this down? Not really, because again, for the most part, the lists kind of run themselves. It might have slowed down the attrition of the list, of essentially people getting themselves kicked off the list, or kicked off their voucher, because people have been staying home and things, and there was those mandates around no evictions and things during the early part of COVID. But for the most part, COVID shouldn't have affected much of that. So again, getting in that list, getting that resource is a very big deal for our population, because they can use it in both the SLS waiver and the DD waiver. There's only one caveat: they cannot use it to live in your home. So they can't use it to pay a family member subsidized rent. But like, I own my own home here, and if I have a fully licensed bedroom in the basement, if I wanted to rent that out to someone with Section 8, I could. I'm the landlord. They have a lease, and I would get guaranteed income, and I get a tax benefit, depending if I wanted to file for that or not. So they could live in a house. They could live with other roommates. And the disability, the DD waiver, as we'll talk next week, there's some other rules around if they're living with you or not, but the only place they can't use it is within your own home. And yes, you are correct. You can't get on a housing list till they're 18. There's no like getting on early or what. Nope, they got to be 18. So that's just one of those sticky rules that they don't let us get on a little bit early, because if they process the whole wait list in 6 months and they're not 18 yet, then they get kicked off anyway. So if you submit but don't get chosen, do you have to submit again, or do they keep people who didn't get in there for the next opening? That depends. Some lists are opened to, they'll allow everyone that applies to be on the wait list. Some are run like a lottery system, so everyone that applies is then run through a lottery, and then that lottery is then put on the wait list. If it's a lottery system, then yes, you have to reapply when the list opens up again, or a different list opens. If it's everyone gets on the list and then we just process through who's really eligible or not when their time comes, then you do not have to reapply. Typically, if you want to make sure, if you're on a waiting list, that you take very good notes of who's the list run by, the contact information for that list, and can you essentially make sure that if you move or something changes, that you're letting them know, so that they aren't calling about an old cell phone number, or they're not calling, sending mail to an address that you no longer live at, because they are very tight turnarounds. They'll give you a certain amount of days to call them and say, yes, I want to accept this voucher and move forward. And then there's a timeline of how quickly your loved one has to find a place to move in and things. So they can't just kind of sit there forever and be like, oh, and not follow up with them. Another question in the chat is, if you apply for a bunch of lists and say, get on the Denvers, can you pass and stay on other lists? Yeah. If you decide to turn down a housing voucher list, which I wouldn't recommend, I mean, unless you really need to be on a federal one, then just make sure you're only applying for the federal ones when they open up. But if you are on, say, the list and it's just for the city of Denver, it's a state run, you have to live in the city of Denver for 12 months and you don't want that one, then yes, you can turn it down, and you shouldn't be kicked off any of the other lists. Typically, you only get kicked off any of the housing voucher lists once you're utilizing a housing voucher. Then they essentially go into their system and they kind of notify everyone else that this person with this kind of number is attached to a housing voucher, and then they can purge you from the other lists. So once you're on one, you shouldn't be contacted by another one because you're essentially kicked out of all the others. But again, there's not a formal list per se out there who governs what lists and when they release it, and there is no laws around how often they have to open. They have to, a law literally states they can open at the discretion of the management of the list. So it's a very kind of, well, we're waiting and seeing, but again, we at the ARC really promote it because it will help them with that rent stability, especially if they're only living on SSI and they have some independent living skills, so they want to live on their own. It's going to be a while, like we talked about with the wait list, to get into the DD waiver to have that residential support. So it would be best to, in the meantime, work on some independent living skills, maybe live in their own apartment, and then you can realize maybe they don't need the DD waiver, as we'll talk about here in a moment. So I use this space again to talk about program approved service agencies, or PASAs. These are the people that are going to do the direct care. So you get into services, you're approved through Medicaid, you're on the waiver, and then you need to find an agency to provide services. That could be support employment, day program, respite, personal care, mentorship, any of those services we talked about, behavioral services that someone is doing with your loved one. So I use respite as the example most of the time. So if you want to, an agency to do respite, you need to find one. Well, how do we find one? We do what's called an RFP, or request for proposal. Your case manager writes an RFP. It's basically an advertisement for your loved one. It's very coded, so it doesn't say Luke Wieland is this. It says L, and typically has a long number after it, is what they sign it by. So it's anonymous, but it's written in a way that, for some of you, I know your loved ones well enough that if I read their RFP, I could probably guess it's them because I know them. But for most agencies, they don't know who you are or your loved one is, so they're just looking at L, who L is and what L likes to do and what L struggles with. So case manager writes it and they send it out to all agencies that are within the catchment area. So roughly the Denver metro area, if you're in Denver, if you're in the mountains, it could be a few counties, could be, a little bit tighter space depending on, what their parameters are. You can ask your case manager, like how many, where it's being sent. It can be sent statewide. So if you're looking at moving, say down to like Colorado Springs, you can preemptively look for providers in the Springs by having them send RFPs to just the Springs or to statewide and seeing what you can get. I recommend read and review your RFPs before the case manager sends them out. These are how you're going to get providers. If it's written crap, if it's written like crap, if it's written badly, you're not going to get good responses. You're not going to get a lot of responses. You don't want it to be all negative or all positive. It needs to be a mix of what they're really able to do and what they struggle with and areas they have. If your loved one has some, aggressive or some, maybe challenging behaviors, they need to have that in there. You need to be honest with the provider, but also you don't want that to be the only sentence, that they hit, kick, and spit. Well, maybe they've done that in the past, or they do that when they're cornered, or they do that if they're, kind of being redirected to something that they know they don't like. That might be a response. So you want to give the context and the caveats to why they have those behaviors or why they have those challenging moments, along with the positives of, he doesn't only kick and hit. He's, very loving and caring. He enjoys pets. He likes going for walks. He, when he's starting to get frustrated, if you offer blank, we typically don't get to the hitting part. We haven't seen that in years. Or if he only hits himself, and if he is, here's how you distract him from that. But you want your RFP to be, it doesn't need to be paragraphs. It needs to be short enough that someone's going to read it, but long enough and descriptive enough that it gives a good picture of who they are. And as the love caring provider for your loved one, you have the right to read it, and so do they if they want, before it's sent out. And a lot of times case managers don't recreate the wheel, so they use an RFP that was written before, because we're all human beings. We don't change overnight. Your loved ones won't either. So I use smoking as an example. If you want to quit smoking, it's highly likely you're not going to quit cold turkey. You're going to work your way down with smoking less, maybe using the patch, whatever, nicotine gum, whatever that might be, right? Your loved one's going to do the same thing with aggressive, challenging behavior or an inappropriate behavior. They're not going to just stop it today and be fine. They're going to work their way down. So you don't want them to use a super old RFP that says they hit and kick anytime they're asked to do anything. You want to make sure they've updated that to be what the current state of their behaviors, positive and negative, are. Again, highlighting those pros and cons for your loved one. So that's the RFP process. So they'll send it out. It typically has like a week or two timeline to get responses. They get them back to the case manager. That case manager then organizes them onto a list. They're not in any set order. They're not necessarily like the top one's the best and the bottom one's not. I can tell you as a case manager, I definitely organized them as the agencies I knew I worked with well went to the top. The agencies that I didn't have a really good relationship with, or kind of always kind of didn't do well by my clients, kind of were at the bottom, because it's human nature. You start at the top of the list and you work your way down. So case managers will send you a list. They might just be randomly of how people apply, like how they've responded. It could be they put them in that order. But it's your job and your loved one's job to reach out to those agencies. So to Google them and look them up online and Facebook and things and call them. You can, right now during COVID, obviously you can't, but you can do, site visits, go visit them. A lot of day programs, and we'll do like come visit us for the day. If we're looking at, behavioral providers, it's looking at what their schedule looks like for them. So this is how you find most services. There's a few other ways you can find services. If you aren't getting good results for the RFP, you can, there's a whole list. So the CCBs have a list, and then the state has the list of all the PASAs that works within the state. And you can perfectly go to it, the state website, it's on there, the PASA list. You can actually break it down by county. The CCBs have a list of all the agencies that they currently work with. And you can read through them and look at each agency and what they provide, and look for the ones that provide respite, or if that's what you're looking for, and then cold call them and say, hey, I saw you on the list. Can we talk about respite? And are you guys taking new clients, and blah, blah, blah. It's a lot of work, but some families find it much more rewarding because they get to kind of see all the choices and then narrow it down themselves instead of waiting for agencies to respond if they have openings or not. Like I've said before, you all are a very powerful entity in this, system. Ask other families. Ask the families that you see with at different IDD events, be it Special Olympics. There's more that happens in the bleachers of Special Olympics than in any class you'll ever take, and any group you'll ever be with, and more than your case manager probably can explain to you, because you're parent to parent and you really listen to that. There's the parent to parent work group, sites on Facebook that you can look up. So Parent to Parent is one of them. That if you're a parent with a kiddo with a disability, a young adult with a disability, you can be on that. And so you can go there and put on, requests looking for a respite provider in the southern part of Denver or the Adams County part of Denver or whatever that might be. You can ask an ARC advocate. So we can't tell you, nope, this one's horrible or this one's great. We can give you the pros and cons again, and we can tell you the ones we've worked well with. There's a few agencies that we don't trust them. We don't think they do a good job. We're going to tell you that. We don't by law have to tell you, positive, negative about all of them. But a case manager does. A case manager has to be impartial. They can't tell you who they like and who they don't like. At the ARCs, we can at least tell you who we've worked well with and who we don't work well with. So, and there's actually, one more option you can always do is, talk to your other providers. So speech, language, PT, OT, if you already have a therapist that's working with your loved one, if they're already doing things like they're going to rec centers like Highlands Ranch and doing things. Highlands Ranch is a PASA for other services. So you can talk to your other providers about, hey, we're really looking for a new job coach. And they might do it as an agency. They might know an agency that their other clients use that does really well. So talk with each other. Also with RFPs, yeah, one more thing here is you don't want them to be too specific. So if you're looking for a respite provider, a lot of times families get no responses. CES and the child waiver, but also in the adult waiver, because they're very specific. We need it to be from 3 o'clock to 5:30, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. That's too specific. Like an agency is not going to be able to fit that in. Agencies that will need a little bit more, like, hey, we're looking for maybe 3 days a week, maybe every other Saturday. Hours are, times are negotiable. You're going to cast a bigger net and get more agencies. Typically, how I suggest to families is throw a big net out there, get some responses, get talking with a few of them. When you get that gut feeling that this one feels right, use them. And then you can, once you're using them, you can start whittling down like what the schedule really looks like and make it very specific to your loved one. It needs to be these, because you've already got that relationship. And so that agency is more willing to kind of adjust to your schedule than it would be if you were just kind of utilizing, throwing out through an RFP, because you're just not going to get them if you're very specific. Same with, like, if you're looking for a day program, well, it needs to be within 6 miles of our home. Yeah, good luck. You're finding one that fits those parameters. When we talk about the residential supports next week, it's the idea of, do we, have it be a white female that has this religion that lives within this many square miles of our house? That's way too specific. You're not going to get enough people to really cast a good net. And if you're that specific, you're probably going to weed out some probably really good candidates that might not fit every criteria you're looking for. So, understanding that what your ideal care provider might be could be completely different than what you find. Also, you don't have to go with an agency for all your services. You can have one agency for respite and another agency doing respite and another agency doing support employment, or they can all be one agency if you want. It depends on how your loved one best fills up that salad plate. Remember, like the SLS waiver we talked about, the salad bar idea. So you can really utilize that. So if you're using an agency and you decide, they don't have availability to do respite on the weekends, have an RFP sent looking for another agency to fill in that gap. Doesn't mean you have to leave your other agency or they're upset by it. You just need to fill the gap. Also, you're not going to be with the same agency forever. It's very unlikely that someone stays at the same day program forever. They might stay with a support, like a job coach or support employment, for a long time, because there's such a, they only come in so often and very little. So over time, maybe it might be the same job coach agency for a long time, but day programs change, residential providers change, respite agencies change. So, the good ones will tell you, like, hey, we've kind of run our course. He doesn't like coming here anymore. We struggle to keep him entertained. Maybe it's time for us to look at something else. I suggest always having open and honest communication with your providers. If you're not happy about something, don't sit there and just think about it and perseverate on it. Talk to them. More than likely, providers will try and adjust how things are going, or they'll tell you, like, this is as much as we can do with the law, or as much as we can do with the funding. So maybe you want to look for a different provider. But I highly don't recommend looking for like a new day program and not telling your old day program, because they might fix the problem before you have to go find a new one. Or they might say, yeah, agree with you, yeah, it's probably time we change, and actually help you find one that's more appropriate. Again, you always have to think that people in the system are here for the right reasons, more often than not. So, any questions on the RFP system or how to find a provider? If you do, throw them in the chat. So the topic of the night is probably the time we spend the least within this session. is the SLS waiver housing options. Here they are. There's essentially 4 of them. They can live in their own apartment, condo, or townhome. They can live in your home, the family home. They can own their own home or rent their own like actual home, not apartment or condo. And they can live in what's called the family-owned PASA. So an apartment, condo, or townhome is going to be the same way any of us are going to live in an apartment, condo, or townhome. They're going to find a place. They're going to, sign the lease, pay the security deposit, first and last month, whatever. That's part of it. So that's the, now rent is an issue. If they're living in their own condo or townhome apartment, they have to pay that rent. It might be tough. If you have a Section 8 voucher, great. Let's use that to help bring down that rental assistance. Or a roommate. It could be an atypical functioning or someone with a disability living with them. So if they're highly independent enough and you have 2 people with disabilities living in a home with services coming in and out, some personal care, so someone's helping them, make sure the apartment's clean with homemaker services. Personal care is helping them maybe cook a meal here and there, or those kind of avenues and mentorship. And there's enough people between them by themselves or them with a roommate that has a disability coming in and out, or them, maybe their roommate is also their care provider. So you can really build an apartment setting relatively easily under the SLS waiver if your loved one's able to have somewhat independent skills. It doesn't mean that they can pack up and go find their own place and live there all on their own and never need help. It means, can they make basic meals? If they're hungry, can they make cereal? Can they know to go get a granola bar? Do they know not to eat raw bacon? Like those kind of concepts. Can really help your loved one? Like if they can do those things, do they know to at least maybe shower, or if someone reminds them to shower, they can shower, or that they shouldn't wear the same clothes every day, or if they do and someone tells them, hey, remember you can't wear that orange shirt again, then they take it off. Like those things, if they're able to do a little bit of that, they probably could live on their own with some SLS supports. Now, that might mean they don't go to a day program or they don't go 4 days a week. It might mean they work, and so they have support employment, and then all the stuff that comes into the apartment to do that. That could be an independent provider, it could be an independent agency, or it could be you. I recommended you all watch the 2 presentations. One's called CDOS, and one was the Family Caregiver Act. So you can be paid to do some of these things if your son or daughter are living in their own apartment, if they're living with you, even under the Family Caregiver Act. So you go over and make sure that they have food in the fridge, and that you're helping them learn, to wash their own laundry. That you're being paid to be the support person under the homemaker services or under personal care, under mentorship. So it could be that level of need. It could be you don't want to do it, so you find an agency that has someone that does that. Or you could find someone that could be their roommate, and then that roommate goes and gets hired by an agency, and then that agency pays that roommate to do some of those daily living skill things. It's pretty open, and families, I've seen some really unique things with the SLS waiver and how families have figured out how to make things work. Again, you can't use a Section 8 voucher if you're living in your own home. So that's something to know, that if you're looking at a Section 8 voucher, they would have to move out to be able to utilize that. But it doesn't mean don't get on a list. Get on a list. Anytime they open up, get on one of those lists. When you're called to see if you want to take it, that's when we can make the decision of, are they ready to live on their own? They're ready to live maybe with someone else in the apartment, but don't do it just because you don't think they can, because it's going to be a few years before they get a call to get off that list anyway. The family-owned PASA is essentially where your loved one owns their own agency. So you go get a Medicaid ID. I just talked with a professional about this yesterday. A family called. She's going to become her own PASA, meaning so she then, her daughter's the PASA. They file the paperwork. They get a Medicaid ID. They provide services. So then her mom will hire her sister to be the respite provider, so that they can pay her sister a higher wage than the current agency they're using for respite, because every agency has to take a cut. They have to have an overhead to keep the lights on, to pay for computers, things like that. So no matter what the rate is, if you're getting, $24 an hour to provide respite for your loved one, that doesn't mean that's how much the person that's providing that service is making. Unfortunately, they have to take some agencies take a bigger cut than others. That would be the same if you were hired, like I talked about in that family caregiver video. There is, you wouldn't just automatically get what the full rate is. You would have to, take what they're going to pay you to do that. So those are the 4 options for them to live in the SLS waiver. Again, it can be done. A lot of times they might live with you, but in the long run, the goal is for them to maybe live on their own, or wait until they get a DD waiver resource, that residential resource, and then they might not live with you anymore. Here's a little bit more on that family-owned PASA. I don't really need to kind of read through it all. You can read it on your own a little bit, but the biggest thing is doing so. It's a lot of work to be your own PASA. You have to have rules and regs. You have to have a Medicaid ID. You have to be surveyed by the state. But doing so opens up a lot of creativity. So I know quite a few individuals that their families are the PASA. And it doesn't mean that they're the best at all the paperwork or the best at keeping everything straight. It just means they figured out enough to be able to do it, or they hire someone to do the bookkeeping and things for them. The biggest component of it is being your own PASA. You essentially can pay your providers a little bit more and not have as much of a cut. So there are some families that run their own PASAs that they don't take a cut at all. They don't pay themselves to run the PASA. They just take all the money from the waiver that's paying for services and give it to the employees for their hourly rate, plus maybe to help pay for health insurance or any other things they're going to do, like maybe they're paying mileage for their vehicle and things. So that's a family-owned PASA. It doesn't really mean you can provide residential services. It means you're kind of figuring out that if you run your own PASA, then you can hire someone to live with them in a townhome and provide that service because you're the one hiring them, not an agency. You're not having to find someone and then have them hired by a separate agency. On that, that's actually the presentation for tonight. So I'll stop the recording and we can go into if there's specific questions.